You've been stepping around them your whole life, disgusted, calling them drowned, feeling a little bad, maybe, but mostly just grossed out, carefully hopping over a sidewalk covered in wriggling pink things after every rainstorm. And here's the embarrassing part. You've had the whole story completely wrong. They weren't drowning, they weren't panicking. Most of them were in the middle of a trip, and you were standing in traffic. So what exactly is going on? Why do worms come out when it rains? Why would an animal that lives underground, safe, dark, damp, suddenly rush to the surface? Why do they always end up on concrete, of all places? Why do so many die there? Are they lost, migrating, and is the rain actually calling them somehow? The answer is stranger and more interesting than anything you learned in third grade. Start with what a worm actually is, because most people think simple. Worms are not simple. An earthworm lives in a world built entirely around one thing: moisture. Here's the part that sounds made up but isn't. Worms breathe through their skin, not with lungs, not with gills. Their skin pulls in oxygen directly from the air around it, but only when that skin is wet. Dry skin means no oxygen gets through. No oxygen means they die, not slowly, fast. So underground, surrounded by damp soil on every side, a worm is living inside a perfect life support system. Dark, wet, protected. It doesn't need to go anywhere. Everything it needs is already there. So if underground is so perfect, why on earth would it ever leave? Here's the theory most people carry around. Rain fills the tunnels, worms start to flood out, they panic, they rush to the surface to avoid drowning, and then they die anyway because they're terrible at surviving in the open. It makes sense, it feels right, it's mostly wrong. Here's the thing, worms can survive fully submerged in water for hours, and depending on the species, possibly much longer than that. They are not fragile, helpless creatures gasping at the first drop of water. They're not fleeing a flood in a panic. The drowning story stuck because that's what we actually see. Dead worms baking on hot pavement after every storm, and we filled in the cause ourselves. But seeing the ending doesn't mean you understand the beginning. So what's really happening? Rain does two things at the exact same time, and both of them matter. First, it soaks the surface. That thin layer between the soil and the open air suddenly becomes safe to cross. A worm can travel across wet ground without its skin drying out. Normally, the surface is a death zone. Too exposed, too dry, too risky to spend more than a few seconds on. But a rainstorm transforms the whole world into a runway. Every rooftop, every lawn, every patch of dirt becomes passable. Second, and this is where it gets crazy, raindrops hitting the ground create vibrations. Those vibrations travel down through the soil in waves, and worms feel them. One strong theory is that worms have evolved over millions of years to read those vibrations as danger signals. Underground predators like moles dig and push through the earth, and their movement creates very similar vibrations in the soil. So when rain hits, the ground essentially sounds like an attack, and the worm's instinct says, "Get out, get up, go now." Rain gives them both a reason to leave and a safe path to do it at the exact same moment. That combination is rare, and worms use it, but here's the key part that almost everyone skips. The surface isn't a refuge, it's a highway. Worms use rain as their one real window to travel long distances. Underground, they're slow, confined to narrow tunnels limited to whatever patch of soil they were born into. But on a wet surface, they can move fast, cover open ground, cross distances that would take weeks underground, find mates in different areas, or push into entirely new soil. Think of it like a road that only opens once. In a while, when it opens, you go. A rainstorm to an earthworm isn't a disaster. It's a travel day. They're not running from something. They're going somewhere specific. So why do so many die on the pavement? Because concrete is a perfect trap. Worms follow moisture. They move toward wet ground and away from dry. Pavement holds water on its surface for a while after rain, long enough to feel like the right direction. But there are no soil signals underneath it, no organic material, no chemical cues saying wrong way, come back. The worm crosses onto concrete and just keeps moving forward, and then the rain stops. The sun comes out. The concrete heats up fast, sometimes much hotter than the air above it. That's the real killer, not the rain. The moment the rain stops, the worm isn't dying because it rained. It's dying because the wet window closed before it could find its way back to soil. Every single dead worm you've ever seen on a sidewalk is a traveler who took a wrong turn, not a creature that drowned in a puddle. Now, not every worm does this the same way. There are a few main types worth knowing, and the differences matter. Common earthworms, the pink, medium-sized ones, usually a few inches long, are your classic sidewalk travelers. They live close to the surface and respond to rain quickly. Nightcrawlers are different. They're bigger, sometimes as long as your hand is wide, and they tunnel much deeper into the ground. They do come up during rain, but usually with one specific goal: finding a mate. You'll often see them stretched halfway out of their holes on wet nights, reaching toward the surface. Then there are red wigglers, the smaller, faster ones you find in compost bins. They don't live in soil at all. They live in decomposing material, rotting leaves, food scraps, so they almost never end up on the pavement. The worms after rain image you've had your whole life? That's mainly one type of earthworm doing one very specific thing. You've been painting every worm with the same picture. Here's where the story gets genuinely old. This behavior has been happening for something like 500 million years. Not 500,000, 500 million. Before birds, before dinosaurs, before anything with a backbone walked on land. Worms were already doing this, and other animals had enough time to notice and build tricks around it. Robins, for example, do something called worm charming. They stomp their feet on the ground in a quick rhythm, not randomly, rhythmically, on purpose. They're creating vibrations in the soil that feel to a worm exactly like rain hitting the surface. A robin isn't just poking around your yard looking cute. It's running a con that took millions of years to develop. It learned to fake a rainstorm well enough to fool an animal that's been responding to rainstorms since before birds existed. That's how ancient and how consistent this worm behavior is. Predators had enough time to evolve an entire hunting trick around fooling it. Humans got there too. Fishermen figured out long ago that rain means worms near the surface, which means easy bait with no digging required. In some parts of England, competitive worm charming events still happen. People use stakes, forks, and vibrating tools to lure as many worms to the surface as possible. World records have been set. That's a real competition. The worm's rain instinct is so reliable and so old that humans turned exploiting it into a sport. And this is where the real surprise lands. Worms are not just a rainy day sidewalk problem. They're inside your daily life already, working constantly, invisibly, in ways you've never credited them for. That soft, spongy feeling when you walk across a healthy lawn. Worm tunnels, hundreds of thousands of them running under every healthy patch of grass, letting water drain down and air move through. The carrots and tomatoes and lettuce you had for dinner were grown in soil that worms spent years building and loosening. Worm waste, called castings, is one of the most nutrient-rich natural fertilizers that exists, packed with minerals that plants pull directly into their roots. Vineyards actually measure how many earthworms live in their soil as a sign of quality. More worms often means better tasting grapes and better wine. Charles Darwin, one of the most careful and detail-obsessed scientists who ever lived, spent more than 40 years studying earthworms and reportedly described them as among the most important animals in the history of the earth. Not the biggest, not the most complex, just the most quietly essential for the longest time. Farmers check for worms surfacing after heavy rain as a health signal. It tells them the soil is alive, rich in organic material, doing its job. Some researchers have even explored whether unusual worm surfacing patterns might signal ground movement before small earthquakes, though that connection is still being studied with no firm conclusion yet. Every science class jar experiment, every fishing trip, every compost bin quietly turning your food scraps into garden gold. Worms are already in all of it. Here's the honest trade-off, though. All of this only works in healthy soil. Urban and suburban soil is often compacted from construction, dry from years of foot traffic, mixed with gravel and concrete dust. Worm populations in city environments are dramatically lower than in forest or farmland, and fewer worms means fewer tunnels, which means rain has nowhere to go when it hits the ground. Instead of soaking in gradually, it runs straight off the surface. Cities with low worm populations flood faster, drain slower, and hold less groundwater for dry periods. So the next time you spot a worm on a wet sidewalk, you're actually looking at a small, specific piece of good news. It means the soil nearby is alive enough to produce them. That worm on the pavement isn't a tragedy. It's a sign that something close by is still working the way it should. Worms come out when it rains because rain is the one moment they can travel freely, find mates, and move to new ground without drying out. The ones on the pavement aren't drowning, they're lost. You've been misreading the whole scene your entire life, and now you can't unsee it.